Hi, I'm Brian Ives, and this is How You Play Your Hand. I'm talking to people who have been through really rough periods and have gotten through them. They're all sharing their stories and discussing what they learned about themselves and what advice they have for people who are going through something similar. I announced my podcast on social media, and I decided I wasn't going to reach out to anyone. I didn't want to ask people to talk about difficult periods in their lives if they weren't comfortable with it. But there were a few exceptions to that rule, and David Dubin was one of them. He was my boss at summer camp and is a great friend and has an inspiring story, and he's great at talking about it. He's beaten cancer 3 times, and he and his wife Robin now run Alive And Kickin, a Lynch syndrome hereditary cancer advocacy organization. Dave, thanks so much for telling your story.
My pleasure, Brian.
So obviously we worked together in the 90s, and as a lot of people did, especially in the pre-social media era, we lost touch a little bit. And then we got back in touch, I think, through Facebook a couple of years later. And we went out to lunch, and you're like, yes, I beat cancer 3 times. And I was like, what? So, I mean, where were you in your life, in your career? I know you were married to Robin. I don't know if you had kids yet when you had it the first time.
So the first time I had cancer, we were married. We had just gotten married. It was one of those times where late 20s, you're get married, get the house, job, all everything happening, first child, and that's when I had my first cancer. It wasn't until I had the second two boys that I had the second cancer. So from a
Right.
timeline standpoint, that was at age 29 the first time, and age 40 the second time.
Wow. And so, I mean, how did like the first time was colon cancer, right? I know 2 of them were colon cancer.
The first two were colon cancer. Yeah.
Got it. So, I mean, where were you in your career? Like, what did you have to sort of change about your life at that point?
It's actually, well, a lot of my story is very interesting and convoluted, and it all kind of blends together, and I kind of have fun with it, and people don't mind. Ironically, at the time, we were working for the family business. We were in the medical supply business, so we were fluent in the language of healthcare, which in and of itself is his own language. And we were a distributor of medical supplies, which included something called ostomy supplies. So, for those who are unfamiliar, ostomy supplies are typically used for someone who has to have their colon removed for whatever reason, usually from like an ulcerative colitis type thing or colon cancer. So here I am, a distributor of ostomy supplies, and then I get colon cancer. Go figure. I did not need any of my supplies, so I did not become one of my own patients, but the irony was there. But the good thing out of all this is that I understood a lot of what I was dealing with, even at a very young age. And I also, since we owned the business, I had the ability to take time off and manage, myself appropriately, where sometimes others just can't.
Yeah, and I mean that's its own separate issue of like people being able to even do what they need to do to take care of it when they are diagnosed with cancer. So, at what point did you start Alive and Kickin'? Because that is like you've sort of taken your experience, and having cancer once is harrowing, having cancer 3 times is triple that, um, and you've sort of turned it into like something good that helps other people and advocates for other people.
Well, what had happened was so the first colon cancer was in 1997. So at the time, we really were not talking about genetics. It was still very much in its infancy. While it was at a very young age, it was almost like a rite of passage, given the fact that my father had colon cancer at a relatively young age, and my grandfather had colon cancer as well. So just kind of like you do it. Um, as you know, since you know my brother, he also had colon cancer 3 years after me. So he was only 37 when he had his colon cancer. In his case, it was only once. But again, this was year 2000. We still weren't talking about genetics that much. It was 2007 where everything really changed. When I had my second colon cancer after a clear colonoscopy barely a year later, that's really when all of the sirens started going off, and people at that time were starting to talk about genetics, and we realized once I had this diagnosis again that there was something genetic taking place, and I had genetic testing, and it was determined to be something called Lynch syndrome, and you would think someone like me would have known something about it because I'm knee deep in this in literally every facet, and I didn't. So once it was determined that I had the Lynch syndrome, and once it was determined that it not only affects your colon, it can affect other parts of your body, other, reproductive, urinary, reproductive, even your brain. I mean, it's and anything gastro. I started having other types of testing done, and that's when I actually found the kidney tumor. Again, so both of these the second one and the third cancer, I had no symptoms whatsoever. I was maintaining a full schedule. I had no idea I had this. I found out about it by donating blood or going to donate blood and my iron count dropping.
Oh,
So that's really how this whole thing plays out, and it's kind of a crazy good story because ultimately it had a decent outcome. Um, but once we determined that it was Lynch syndrome, my wife and I, Robin, we looked into the advocacy space for Lynch syndrome, and we didn't see anything. So we felt, but the more we learned about Lynch, we learned that it was, such a prevalent disorder that no one had heard of, including us. We decided to take it upon ourselves to create a foundation geared towards bringing awareness and education to a very prevalent disorder, which really to this day, still is a very unknown disorder.
I mean, I learned most of this stuff just from being friends with you over the years and reading the stuff that you share and everything like that. It sounds almost crude to ask in this way, but it feels like the space that you're in with Alive and Kicking is a difficult space to be in because there's so many kinds of cancers and there's so many things that there's so many advocacy groups for not only cancer but different types of health issues, and other political issues as well. I mean, how do you sort of put your stake in the ground and say, we're here, this is something important that you should pay attention to slash donate money to?
Well, Brian, you actually you hit the nail right on the head on that. I mean, this is an issue that we face on a regular basis. Um, so much of us, so much of us, that's not even English. So much, we all focus on body parts, and it's a very easy thing to do. We can understand breast cancer, we can understand colon cancer, we can understand ovarian cancer, all of these body parts.
Yeah.
What needs to be understood with Lynch syndrome is that this is a germline mutation, a genetic disorder that affects literally every cell in your body. It just happens to manifest itself typically as colon cancer or endometrial cancer or both. Obviously, endometrial only in females. But so the way we've approached it is I consider myself a Lynch syndrome patient who happens to have had colon cancer twice and a kidney tumor. And
Mhm.
that's been our way of dealing with this. And interestingly enough, is a couple of years ago, the FDA approved a certain drug for a drug called Keytruda by Merck. It's an immunotherapy drug that would be tumor agnostic. So essentially, it's designed to treat someone like someone who has Lynch syndrome, who has a germline mutation that typically manifests itself as what are called microsatellite high unstable tumors. So I apologize if I'm going, way into the weeds, but um, the good thing and the bad thing about Lynch is that it's really being studied really heavily right now because we make certain types of tumors, and our tumors have a certain genetic makeup that is really can be treated very well with immunotherapy. I mean,
Mm.
I don't want to throw out the word miraculous, but I've seen almost miraculous recoveries from people who were very late stage cancers with Lynch syndrome, and you know, really, what our goal is to try and get more people to understand that this mutation is very prevalent. They should be tested before they get cancer,
Right.
because once you know you have it, you can be proactive in your care. It may not prevent a cancer from happening, with something like Lynch or other types of mutations, but you can catch it early, and if you know you have it, you can treat it the right way, not necessarily the standard way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I haven't had to deal with it, but like, yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense. But talk about how, when you start Alive and Kicking itself, just in the name, it sort of encompasses, instead of being something sad, you've always been a football or American football or European football American soccer fan,
I
and
know what you
Alive and
mean.
Kickin is a direct reference to that. And you've had like 24-hour soccer marathons and stuff like that. I mean, you sort of made it into something. And I also know that you've got a great sense of humor and stuff like that. Like, you've sort of made it into something that reflects your personality and is more uplifting than maybe other organizations like that would be.
I wouldn't say that we made it to be more uplifting than others might be, but we modded actually when we created the name. Yes, the name stems from my love of the game of soccer. Yes, so even through cancer number one, two, three, and up until really until I turned 50, I was still playing soccer, and I coached the boys. So Alive and Kickin' did seem like an apropos name. And we always wanted it to be a brand that people could be comfortable with talking about in public, and quite frankly, wearing a T-shirt or a hat or a beanie, whatever the case may be. Almost, because at the time when we started the foundation, Live Strong was the name out there in the cancer world. Obviously, it took a blemish with what happened with Lance Armstrong, but realistically, that's what we modeled it on.
Right.
You look at Live Strong and I mean, you still see it to today. You still see the name all over stuff, and I don't think there was ever there was, even with what happened, there was never a negative connotation, and it was never considered sad or we
Yeah.
wanted something to get behind, and that's what we did.
Yeah, yeah. It seems to have taken you to some really interesting places too. I mean, I know you don't post to Facebook as much as you used to, but like there would be pictures of you with politicians, and I was with you at a Red Bulls game. Like, talk about some of the places that you wouldn't have expected yourself to be in that you were in.
I'll talk about one. How's that? So yeah, so a number of years ago when we launched our registry, so one of the big issues with Lynch syndrome is aggregating data. So you go to a hospital, you get treated at, well, let's pick a local one, a Hackensack or a Mount Sinai, some of these places that are my home away from home. Each of them has their own registry, as they should. So they're maintaining a Lynch syndrome registry in each of their institutions. However, typically they don't talk to each other. That's how it works in healthcare. That's unfortunate, but that's how it works. So their patients, a Lynch syndrome patient could get treated one of those. They go into the registry there, which is good, but at the end of the day, it doesn't. There's no communication in between them. What we did was a number of years ago, we launched a registry that was patient driven and therefore was institutionally agnostic. So that if I'm a Lynch syndrome patient at Sinai, yes, I go to the registry there, but I can also put my information into the Alive and Kickin' registry. We called it the Heroic Registry. Um, and everyone is consented. It was IRB approved. It was really done the right way. So the privacy settings are all there. People can opt to share their data with whoever they want. People could opt to share this data with nobody. That's their choice. So it was all there. And it really had a dramatic effect. So what was happening is researchers were reaching out directly to us through the registry because all of these people were consented. And quite frankly, 99.9% of them agreed to share their data. Like, yeah, have at it. Let's make a difference. And it really started to get noticed. So at the time, I'm talking 4 or 5 years ago, I guess. At this point, there was what was called the Biden Cancer Initiative that was run by, obviously, at the time, Joe Biden, who was, he'd been relinquished his role as vice president, and he was not running at the time. And the Biden Cancer Initiative the idea was to bring together organizations that were making a difference in the space in the cancer world, obviously. So we got invited to be a participant, and not only did get invited to be a participant, but we got invited to have lunch with Joe Biden. And when I say we, I will say Robin, because at the time I was working for Mount Sinai Genetics, and only one of us was invited. So Robin got invited. I was able to go to the conference, and Robin got to have lunch with Vice President Biden and I think the CEO of Lyft or Uber. There was a couple other very high profile people, and then Robin. And the story goes is that each of the 10 people or so that was there introduced themselves, told their story, and so Robin starts telling Vice President Barton our story, and so Biden says to Robin, so how's your husband doing? And Robin's like, he's fine. He's down the hall he's meeting with, I don't remember who, and he's like, well, bring him in. So like Robin starts texting me. It's like she's like, get your ass in here, and the vice president Biden wants to meet you. So I see this, and I'm in the middle. I'm like, I'd like drop everything. I'm in the middle of the conference, and I go out the door, and I realize I don't know where they are. So I start sprinting towards where I hope they would be, and I find somebody who tells me, where they are, and I'm thinking to myself, what do I do? Do I bust in the door? Am I going to get nailed by Secret Service? I figure I'm going to get, I'm just going to get my clock cleaned, and sure enough, I go in. I am now dripping in sweat. I'm in a full suit, right? And he turns to me and he says, well, I guess like, so you and I have something in common. We both married up. And that's how the conversation went. And I, of course, I had actually brought my town when I ran for. Remember, I ran for town
Yeah.
council in
Yeah. Yeah.
2007. So there I am. I was on the ballot with Biden, Obama, Frank Lautenberg, John McCain, like really good
Wow.
names. And I saved it. I saved my paper ballot. I mean, it is a big thing. And I made Robin bring it with her to the lunch, and he autographed it. So yes, I've had that's my Biden story. I got others, but I love that one. And
I mean, that's a great story for sure. So what have you learned about yourself throughout all of this? I mean, like, when you told me about this, and even that was probably 10 or 15 years ago when we reconnected. I mean, your life had changed so radically since we knew each other when we were both like in college. So what have you learned throughout this entire thing about yourself?
oh goodness. Well, I mean, how do I feel like um when you're growing up, you don't always know what your role is going to be in life.
Mm,
We're all, we're human, and as teenagers and even in your 20s, you're still trying to find yourself. Um, Not to be egotistical about it, but I feel like this is where I was meant to be. Um, it's always a balance between being positive and being too positive. Because I have been accused of both. Because a lot of people are going through a lot of stuff, and whether it's lynch related, or financial,
yeah.
whatever the case may be. I've had the good fortune of a very happy marriage, and Rob and I have been together since I had hair. I mean, no one understands why she stayed with me, but she did, and the boys are above average. We live a comfortable, decent life, and I'm comfortable sharing my world with the Lynch syndrome world, and at the same
Yeah.
time, I'm actually and it's segued into a career in genetics, where I'm doing the same thing, but it just in cancer genetics overall. So yeah, I'm okay with it so far.
And so you like, in a weird way, this has helped you find where you belong. Wow. I know this is a question you probably get a lot, but what is your advice for people? I always ask at the end of this, like, what's your advice for people who are going through something similar? In your case, I know you give that advice to people probably pretty frequently. Somebody is first diagnosed and they're understandably probably terrified. Like, what is your advice to them?
Well, my first advice is always the same for whatever it is, and that is have someone next to you who's taking notes, because anytime you're hit with something unexpected that's potentially traumatic, you immediately. I'm not saying everybody, but you tend to like all of a sudden everything becomes like a fog, and you don't retain 90% of anything that's said to you, and that's the reality of getting hit in the face with a frying pan. So that's my first advice. And then the second advice is becoming your own advocate, and that's really pertains to healthcare specifically, because again, it is its own language, its own world, its own system, its own business. Healthcare is um, it's a twisted beautiful, ugly mess that does some great stuff if you can navigate it. And if you can't navigate it, you're on the outside, and that's a problem.
Well, I mean, we were talking about this before we started recording, but like people get information in varying places, and I think with cancer that's particularly dangerous if somebody's just googling it. Like, what are good resources that you are comfortable with recommending for people? Or are there any more, just sort of general ones for cancer, or are they all just specific to their kinds of cancer?
Well, in the cancer world, you're dealing with like the NCCN. You're dealing with Society of Clinical Oncology. I mean, there are medical societies that are important. NIH, the ones that are run out of DC. Those are really the trusted ones. And then depending on what your specific issue may be, then you may have a nonprofit that works in that space, and that's always good as far as conversation and discussion and playing things off. And then of course you got your physician offices and the staff that work there. Those are still typically trusted resources. But I will also say that, and I say this is my other part of advice, is that make sure you have, if you have the option, make sure you have physician and physician offices that understand you. I've been very upfront in saying, if you're gonna be my practice, whether it's for urology, gastroenterology, whatever the case may be, I'm going to get your cell phone. You're going to respond to me, and I'm not going to cry wolf, but that's how it works with me. And if you're not comfortable with that, that's fine. You don't have to be my physician, or you don't have to be my practice. And a couple of them said, "Yeah, I don't work that way," and that's fine. I'd rather know in advance rather than on a Saturday night when I'm bleeding out. And yeah,
And you need answers now, and you can't wait till Monday.
right.
Sure. So where can people find you and find out more about Alive and Kickin' and all the things that you do?
Well, just like you, we're on Facebook. It's funny. I say it because I feel like we have to be.
Yeah.
We do have a Facebook page, obviously. So everything is spelled Alive and Kickin', AliveandKicken. So it never fails that people try and add the I and the G at the end and make it Alive and Kicking, which is a different organization, which is fine. I do know those guys, and they do forward stuff that comes our way through them sometimes. But so it's Alive and Kickin' and .org. So that is the website. We have a Twitter feed. We have an Alive and Kickin' Twitter feed. I believe it's alive underscore and underscore KICKN is the Twitter feed. I also have a personal Twitter feed of Alive and Kickin' DD. Same with Instagram. We have an Alive and Kickin' Instagram page, and I have an Alive and Kickin' DD Instagram page, and LinkedIn. Do a lot of professional work on LinkedIn as well, both for the foundation and for the day job. Um, what else is there?
I
Is there
think you've
more?
pretty much covered all of social media unless you're joining TikTok.
I have not. I've not done TikTok. I did it once. I cooked something, and my kids told me to do a TikTok, and it was a bad experience. But the food was good, so I am not on TikTok. I've
Fair
started
enough.
doing a couple of reels. I don't know if that counts as anything.
I mean, Reels is kind of TikTok for Instagram. It's
There
kind of
you
the
go.
same thing. So, well, thank you so much for sharing your story, Dave. I totally appreciate it. Thank all of you for watching and or listening. And we'll catch you next time on How You Play Your Hand. And if you want to follow me at Instagram at PlayYourHandPC, that's where I am. And if you want to email me about being on the podcast or questions about any episodes, I'm at bri331 at gmail.com. Thanks again, Dave.
Pleasure.